Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
The girl who lived in that horrible world considered it the truest hell. She was in prison with the rest of the girls, who did not feel safe there because they could be killed or worse at any moment. One day a guard came to them, and as he opened the bars, he told His Excellency that he had arrived at last, and also asked that he might admire them. So Mr. Marquis entered the underground prison. He looked like a man of status, but he was also dissatisfied with something. In the world the girl inhabited, the strong always insulted and hurt the weak. The guard turned to the Marquis and told him not to pay attention to the fact that they were dirty because they were just about to wash them. During all this time, the girls looked at them fearfully, not understanding what was going on. The guard also said that even though it was just an appetizer before the auction, they would still prepare them properly. And after that, he took one of the girls who was crying. The truth is that those who were completely unlucky enough to be born a nobleman were powerless. Then suddenly the Marquis stopped the guard and, pointing to another girl with dark hair, told him to give him that one. They then took her out of the jail cell and threw her on the floor right in front of the Marquis. The man smiled and told her not to worry because he would definitely buy it. He was just a horrible person. Moving closer and closer to the little girl, he said that driving desperate girls who pretend to be insensitive to him is the best thing in the world. The girl was silent for a while, and then she took off her handcuffs and answered that the data were probably correct. That guard who was standing behind immediately fell to the ground unconscious after those words. When the Baron saw this, he was very surprised. He didn't realize what was going on at all, and then turning back towards the girl, asked if they were following him. But the man didn't have time to finish that last sentence because she stuck a syringe right into his neck and injected him with some kind of liquid. He fell to the ground, wriggling in pain. His mouth even began to foam. The girl at that moment went to a bucket of water that stood nearby and wet a rag and came back to the Baron and said that she was his death. Smiling smugly, she said goodbye to His Excellency the Marquis and then threw the bunch of keys back into the cell so that the children could get out. In the world she lives in, the weak have no choice but to devour themselves to avoid being eaten. The girl put on her cloak so that no one would recognize her immediately in case of anything and headed into town. It was raining heavily outside. Soon she went into the shop where she was handed money as a reward. The man behind the bar said there was no mutilation or traces of poison on that guy. According to the order, it looks like a heart attack. He looked at the little girl in surprise and said that apparently it was all quite easy for her to do. But he also added that he could expect nothing less from the goddess of death. Then he handed her a piece of paper and told her that this was her next order. In that world, people who possessed power, in order to continue to possess it, must simply devour others. Just as the girl started to leave the shop after taking the necessary papers, she heard other people talking behind her. One of the men looked at her silhouette in surprise and asked, "Is this really the girl who is the legendary assassin?" But a longshoreman passing by him looked at the guy in surprise and asked, "Isn't she a little young for that?" The seller told him not to let his eyes deceive him because she is the most real monster, which has already killed more than a dozen people. After the girl went outside, she went in an unknown direction and, passing under a thunderstorm, suddenly heard some strange sounds nearby. It was a little kitty who was on the very top of the roof. He was all shaking with cold and shambling. And the bartender said she doesn't care if it's a woman, a man, an old man, or even a child. She'll kill her target without a shred of emotion. She's so cold-blooded that she takes on the next task immediately, and she doesn't care at all about how much the person has suffered or whether they have a family or not. At that moment, the girl walked over to the little kitten and covered it with her cloak to stop the rain from dripping on it. The animal, when it felt dry, immediately looked at her with joy and was incredibly grateful to the girl. However, due to the heavy rain and flimsy construction, the rocks on which the girl was sitting began to collapse, and she flew headlong downwards, holding a kitten in her arms. Immediately afterward, the girl opened her eyes and heard someone's voice speaking just about her. She was sitting in some white building with many angels around her and some man sitting nearby. All these angels spoke of was that she had taken the lives of several hundred people and was the worst of the worst. That's why these beings recommended that she be sent to hell. All the angels agreed and said she was just a horrible person and didn't deserve to be in heaven. But then, the kitten who was flying down with her suddenly spoke. He turned to the angels and said that this honored man had helped him, so he asked them to have mercy on her. When he said those words, the girl immediately remembered that she had saved that cat after all, and then died. Kotick continued to speak in her defense and said that she actually had a very good heart, and turning to her, he asked, "Is he right?" But the girl, turning away from him, said that it was quite untrue, for she just had a terrible temper. He immediately moved closer to her and inquired, "What is it saying?" And also asked, "Does she really want to go to hell?" But she didn't even look at him and said she didn't care at all. She always wanted to die, but no one could kill her. Then suddenly, the man who was sitting on the throne laughed and asked how it was possible that with her terrible character, she ended up saving someone's life. He then turned to the angels and suggested that they try to assign her to the case they had been talking about before, because in his opinion, she was perfect for it. At that moment, some kind of magical light began to appear around the girl, and then a loud voice said that she should learn the power of love. For a while, everything around her became too dark and she felt nothing. But soon she heard a distant voice. She didn't understand what had even happened, or what this place she found herself in. But for some reason she felt incredibly good, warm, and pleasant. As soon as she started to open her eyes, she saw some man who was glad when she did. He called her a sweet little angel, pulled her close to him, cuddling her, and also wondered if it was time to feed her yet. The girl felt, and seeing all this, immediately tensed up. She didn't understand what had happened at all, or where she was. Soon after, she was put in her crib, and two boys started bouncing around her with various toys and bottles. They called her Princess and asked, "What does she want?" The girl herself lay on the bed completely unmoving and only stared at them emotionlessly. She didn't understand what kind of hell she was even in, nor why everything around her was so strange. But after a while she was able to find out some pretty useful information, at least that her name was Patricia von Anecki. She was an ordinary infant and she was about a year old. The world she had lived in before had been the ultimate hell, so she, who had ruined so many lives, even dying, had returned to an even worse place. One of the men handed her a bottle of milk and told her to drink it because it was still warm. The other guy, however, said she wasn't hungry. "See, it's obvious she wants to play," and handed her a rattle. Patricia herself sat without any emotion and remembered what she knew at all. She recalled the plot that had recently appeared in her mind and realized that it had not been a dream. In her past life, her name had been Toth, and she had also been given the nickname of the Goddess of Death. She was the most legendary assassin of all. However, the girl didn't understand why her past life had been cut short so suddenly. At that moment, someone's hands suddenly reached out and took her in their arms. The man was Leonhard von Anecki, Patricia's older brother. He drew her closer to him and asked her what had happened, for she looked very sad. Patricia, of course, said nothing back to him, and he kissed her on the cheek and told her that she was, as always, incredibly smart and beautiful. Leonhard also added that despite the indifferent expression on her face, she was still incredibly sweet. She was then approached by Gilbert, who was also her older brother. He took her in his arms and told his brother that she wanted to cuddle with him, and it was all obvious. He kissed her on the top of her head and asked if she wanted to play a little. He kissed her on the top of her head and asked if she wanted to play a little. He indignantly says he can't say he doesn't like it. However, he and Patricia go to his mother's house. Patricia eventually guessed that these two, Leon and Gilbert, were her older brothers. The boy, indignant, told his brother that he wanted to visit his father with her and thought it would be best for her. Patricia was well aware that they just wanted to see their little sister, whom they hadn't seen for a year. And no matter how you look at this situation, in her past life the girl was an orphan, so all these tenderness for her seems quite strange and unusual. Then suddenly a voice in her head remembered when she was in heaven and told her to know love at last, as an unfeeling person. And when Patricia thought about it, she suggested that that was probably what it was all about. The girl was busy thinking and her brothers were busy arguing, so none of them noticed some armed man sneaking onto the veranda. He quietly opened the veranda door and had already climbed into the room, and Patricia kept thinking about the fact that that unknown man had said something about the place. She certainly didn't know what it might be suitable for, however, there was still something about it all the same. The babies, so she slowly snatched the hairpin from Gilbert, which was rather sharp. Because she had well-developed instincts due to her past life, she managed to turn around in time and threw that hairpin at the unknown man. The jewelry hit the killer right in the eye before he could attack her older brothers. The guy tried to hold back a scream to avoid being declassified and slowly walked back up. Patricia watched him in surprise and did not understand where the killer could have come from, and most importantly, what for. But at this point, the man began to lose consciousness due to severe blood loss and shock, so when he came to the very edge, he simply fell over the veranda. When this happened, the brothers heard some heavy rumbling, so they immediately became silent and turned toward the window. Gilbert stepped closer and asked, "Since when was the window open?" "They kept it closed so Patricia wouldn't freeze." The guy immediately went over and closed it, saying that she could definitely catch a cold that way, so he'd better not create unnecessary drafts. Then suddenly, Gilbert looked down and saw that his brooch was missing from his uniform. He was very surprised. His brother turned to him and looked rather alarmed and wondered if he had left her near Patricia. Gilbert replied that he was well aware that it might be too dangerous, so he would never do that. But it was all rather strange, for he had only hooked it in the morning. Leonhardt took his sister in his arms and then put her back to bed, wondering if she was for self-defense. The boy nodded, and then his brother suggested that they look for her together, for it might be too dangerous. Patricia lay in her crib and watched them moving away from her. Before leaving, the boys smiled and said goodbye to her, and Gilbert asked that she behave herself and get some rest. Then they went out the door and shut it behind them. When the girl heard this, she was very happy that they had finally left. As soon as she closed her eyes, she immediately found herself in the same place somewhere above the heavens and saw the man who had sent her to that horrible world. Seeing the baby in front of him, he smiled happily and said hello to her and called her the goddess of death in a sarcastic tone. Patricia immediately remembered who the man was, and the guy, seeing her serious expression, said that apparently she was even able to get her memories back. But smiling, he suggested that this conversation should not be postponed to a useless elucidation of details and said that for his sake she would save this kingdom, which was on the verge of collapse. With her killing skills, she must save it and the inhabitants who dwell there. When Patricia heard this, she was very surprised and didn't understand how she should do it, since she's just a baby who can't even talk. When the man saw the look on her face, he asked her not to be so surprised. After that, he used his magic to lift her up. Then he dragged her over to the big toy bear, where he threw the little girl. The unknown guy said that the kingdom she was born into would just collapse very soon. She was reborn 200 years before the time in which she lived. During her era, this kingdom had long since been forgotten and abandoned. Patricia couldn't talk, so she mumbled something in her own language. But since this man was omnipotent, he immediately realized she was asking what it all meant. So he replied that it was as she understood it. Members of the royal family were not prone to suspicion or even to trivial caution. One by one, they fell victim to assassination attempts. Soon war was declared and the kingdom was finally destroyed. That was their destiny. However, that fate needed to be changed. Besides, he can't intervene, unfortunately, personally in this situation, so he needed help. Patricia looked at him angrily and said that even though she was called the goddess of death, even she couldn't change fate. But the man, smiling, replied that it was because she was the very goddess of death that she was the one capable of doing this. With a strong enough influence in that world, absolutely anything is possible. She needs to become stronger. He also said that the fact that she would have to start over was his punishment for her. The goddess of death, the worst of the worst, who had taken so many precious lives that he had given, she must pay for her sins. Patricia was not very happy about such news, so she said that she was also a human being, after all, and not at all omnipotent. After a moment's thought, the man replied that, of course, that was the big problem. It was important to him, and that was why he had thought of something else. Despite her temper, she still helped that cat who was all alone and freezing, which means that her soul can still get better if given a chance. To her, who has never known love, he will try to show her what it really is. She's still very young, so he told her to behave appropriately for her age, control her mental faculties, and of course her killing skills. He advised her to use her power to protect the family she now lived in and prevent the destruction of that kingdom. Patricia was silent for a while, and afterward, with a heavy sigh, said that he was incredibly annoying to her. And then, thinking about it, she asked if he had changed much since their last meeting, and wondered if he had definitely been then. When the guy heard this, he became very indignant and told her to have respect since he is actually an angel. But the girl, objecting, drew back to the side and replied that she had not a single reason for listening to him. Angel tried to get out of it somehow and said that just because she had gotten her memories back from her past life didn't mean at all that she had forgotten everything from her new one. He wondered if she would really be okay with her family just dying because of her own guilt, since she didn't want to protect them. Patricia pondered these words for a while, and afterwards said that she really didn't understand what love was. Angel, of course, had been hoping to hear something completely different, and when he saw the indifferent look on her face, he was very upset. But then, waving his hand, he turned around and said she had no choice either way. When Patricia heard this, she was very surprised, and the angel said that she who did not know love should know it and protect it with all her strength. The girl began to move again to some place unknown to her, and the angel told her lastly to do it, and then she could have her freedom. Patricia wanted to ask him to stop and negotiate with him, but it was no use. When she opened her eyes, she realized she was back in that room. Right in front of her, she saw the huge silhouette of a man standing, aiming a knife at her. The girl was not confused, so she immediately took the pillow that was lying next to her and threw it straight at this killer. He lost sight of her for a while, and when he looked again at the crib, he saw that she was no longer there. Patricia at this moment ran away from the other side and, pressing a special point on the bully's shoulder, thanks to which he simply lost consciousness. When this happened, the girl sat on his back and realized that the lives of the royal family members were indeed in great danger. And that also means that Patricia is in incredible danger as well. But now, because she is in a baby's body, she must also follow certain restrictions. First, she is not allowed to commit suicide or take any action that will lead to her death. Second, you can't tell anyone about your past. Third, Patricia can't tell anyone about her mission. She walked over to the bully and took the sword from his hands, and realized that these restrictions bound her soul, so breaking them would definitely not work for her. She would even like to forget about them for a while, but she couldn't, because it was as if they were burned into her mind. It really annoyed Patricia. And the mission she's been given is to save a kingdom destined to fall, to protect a family targeted by assassins using their mighty power. And all this she must do until 11 years have passed. The deadline was a pretty small one, because on the day of her 12th birthday, the kingdom was destined to fall. Patricia as a whole didn't care about that, but she must follow the angel's orders to finally free herself. The girl sighed heavily, not understanding in any way why she was constantly being assigned a job with a very poor reward. And that's what she was going to do this mission for, and afterward kill the angel who came up with it. Quite often, Patricia remembered moments from her past, how she had had to chase down people she needed to kill. Once one man had already gotten excited and thought he could get away from her. However, he simply underestimated the strength of his opponent, who could even climb over walls. She quickly climbed up and slashed his body so that he fell to the ground. The girl didn't understand who he even thought she was, or how he could underestimate her abilities. And now that she was in Patricia's body, and her mother came to her, She held out her hands and asked that the girl go to her. It annoyed her immensely, and smiling nervously, she didn't realize who this woman even thought she was. Lawrence, who was Patricia's father, suddenly spoke. He turned to his wife and wondered if it was too early for her to walk. He explained that you could even see from afar that it was taking all of her strength just to stand on her feet, and she was already demanding to be approached. Her mother, whose name was Julia, laughed and told His Highness that he was too worried about his daughter, for he was much stricter with Leon and Gilbert. The man sighed heavily and said that Patricia was completely as beautiful and fragile after all. So he thought it was only natural that he was worried that she might hurt herself. And besides, if you look closely, she has such short little legs and very fragile arms. And the way she stands leaning on her crib, you want to go over and pick her up. He said that she was perfection itself, given to them by the gods themselves. The mother agreed with him, for they loved their daughter dearly, and they were very fond of her. Patricia soon realized that these two are her parents. Despite their behavior, they are the king and queen of the country of Shaden. Her family included her parents and two older brothers, and her goal was to protect those four from trouble. But this was something new and unusual for her, for she had never guarded anyone before, but had only done custom assassinations. Then Lawrence suddenly spoke, and he said that she must have learned to walk much earlier than her brothers. When his wife heard this, she immediately smiled and said she didn't think he remembered it. As she got closer to her daughter, she also said that when Patricia tried harder, she became even cuter, though the woman didn't know how that was even possible. The girl herself became incredibly annoyed with these succulents and cute statements, and she even thought about hitting her parents. Soon she was sitting on the floor again and realized that she could walk comfortably. Patricia assumed that the ridiculous creature called God had done something to her body. She realized it because she had become much stronger than she looked. It was hard to know exactly how much, but she could walk comfortably and, moreover, move faster than even her parents. Patricia even felt a little sorry that she had to act like a baby, for otherwise she would have had more freedom and autonomy. Suddenly, her mother came close to her and, taking her in her arms, wondered if she was already tired. After that, she hugged her daughter and kissed her on the forehead, apologized, and told her that it was time for her to rest because the lunchtime nap had not been canceled. After that, they came to her room and, putting her on the bed, looked at her for a while longer. Patricia didn't understand how she was supposed to know this love because she couldn't see or touch them. They don't even eat together. So she didn't know how she was supposed to get close to them and learn all these new feelings. Some time had passed since then. The girl went out on the veranda to get some fresh air. In fact, after absolutely every memory of her past life came back to her, she realized that in the entire castle, Patricia's room was the easiest to sneak into. Moreover, since she is an infant, she is like the easiest target, making it quite easy to meet an assassin on her way. There was a river running right below her balcony, and because of all this, she could dispose of both the bodies and the murder weapons. It was pretty convenient for her. She also suggested that until she finally got all her memories back, she had been protected by God during that time, and the result of a year of successful protection was a constant stream of murderers in front of her eyes. When Patricia killed another person, she immediately threw away the poison with which she had done it and thought about the fact that it was pretty hard for her to be popular. The fact that she was almost killed once only reinforces her parents' overprotective concern for her. So the girl even suggested that perhaps if she showed them her speed and agility, they might calm down a bit. But then she decided that if she scared them that way, they might even kick her out of the house. After a while, her mother knocked on her door and she had a whole plate of sweets in her hands. She turned to her daughter and said it was time for afternoon snack. But when she saw the body Patricia was sitting on, she was so surprised that she even stammered. Julia, seeing this, could not even hold the plate with sweets, and it fell to the ground and broke. The woman started screaming loudly in fear for her daughter. She immediately ran up and took her in her arms. After that, she put her sword on the bully and asked how he could hurt a child who couldn't even walk yet. Patricia felt a strange feeling at that moment, and she didn't know what it meant. She was immediately uncomfortable with it. She realized that this could end badly, so she immediately began to climb down from her mother's arms and walk away, not realizing who they even had her for. Julia, when she looked at her beautiful Patricia, was very surprised and happy, for her daughter had already learned to walk. She even called her a genius. And now a whole year has passed since she was reborn into this princess. And quite recently, Patricia has realized one very important thing. When Julia explained the whole situation she had recently learned, she immediately said that was why they had to remove the balcony from Patricia's room. She also said that if you can't clean the balcony, you should at least change the doorknobs to blades, because the real killer had snuck into Patricia's room. But the girl was not even the slightest bit surprised by this, because it happened all the time. So she would even be surprised if one day some murderer didn't come to her. After listening carefully, her husband told his queen that it could not be done yet. However, he offered to appoint a nanny to watch over her absolutely every minute of her life. He also said that their country was very proud of the strength of their warriors, and he would personally choose a man from the royal guard for the role. But Julia kept shouting and said that she couldn't do that, because Patricia just hated strangers, and if someone was going to be outside her room all day and night, she certainly couldn't stand it. Leon turned to her brother in a whisper and said that she had disliked the previous nanny from the first time she saw her. His brother agreed with him and said that he even remembered the girl sobbing for 24 hours and not being able to calm down because of it. In fact, what Patricia has only recently realized is that when it comes to her, the family are even bigger idiots. Even though she doesn't remember well what it was like before she got her memories of her past life back, with those same memories, she would definitely grow up to be the ultimate selfish person. Except for her, her parents did a pretty good job raising her brothers. However, it may be the result of God's actions that sent her there. Eventually, the girl had nothing else to do, so she decided to interrupt their discussion and cried loudly to get attention. As always, she succeeded in doing so. The mother immediately became worried and ran up to her. Everyone stood over the girl and worried. They took turns asking what had happened, and also why she was crying. Gilbert even began to blame his brother for doing something wrong. Patricia had to do it, for only by crying could she stop the arguments in that family. Because if they didn't stop, she certainly wouldn't stop crying. They walked around her and tried to calm her down and figure out what had gone wrong. Leon then suggested that perhaps she sensed the negative atmosphere that came from their conversation. When they heard that, they were very surprised, especially Gilbert. He went up to his sister and said that they hadn't really argued, so she shouldn't worry so much. When the little girl heard those words, she immediately smiled through her tears, and her whole family was relieved to finally be able to exhale. Her brothers and father immediately began to marvel at her smile, for it really was just beautiful. Patricia herself, sitting in her mother's arms, realized that when she cried, they were so worried that as soon as she smiled, they immediately calmed down. After that, the girl thought about love and realized that since she was trying to protect them in every way possible, maybe she should smile as often as possible. And so 6 more years had passed since then. Patricia had grown up and was quite an adult. The assassins kept climbing toward her again, and the girl had nothing else to do but kill them. One day when she did it again, Nanny started looking for her, asking where Mrs. Patricia was. The girl quickly threw the bully over the veranda and went back to her room. She came closer to her and told her that she had arrived. When she saw the face of her nanny, whose name was Deborah, Patricia wondered what was wrong, for she looked worried. Patricia was 7 years old at the time, and when Nanny saw her, she was overjoyed. She said she should hurry up because her father was calling her. Accompanied by her nanny, she went to her father's study and checked her dress. There was no blood on it, and she handled the body calmly. So Patricia was quite curious as to why she had been summoned, since she had done her job just perfectly. Shortly thereafter, knocking, she went inside and inquired of her father if he had summoned her. As soon as the girl stepped inside, she immediately sat down across from her father. Her mother was also standing next to him. When Lawrence saw her, he immediately smiled, said hello, and said he was very happy to meet her. "To," And then he added that they had decided who would be her fiancé. When Patricia heard this, she was so surprised that she didn't even hide her surprise on her face. Her father said her fiancé would now be Julius. My mom, who was standing nearby, giggled and said that they had seen each other before, but she was just a little girl then and probably didn't remember. She explained that he was the prince of a neighboring country. Lawrence agreed with his wife and said that was why they were going to visit them. Julia also added that she was staying at home with her brothers, so she advised the girl to behave well and decent. When Patricia heard this, she was furious. She didn't understand how they were going to visit a neighboring country without her protection. They wouldn't last a day there. Mother also asked her not to tell her brothers about it, for they might be offended. And so a few days passed from that moment. Her parents went to a neighboring state, and she and her brothers stayed in town. The girl walked with a very serious expression on her face and realized that she was violating her parents' order. When they had walked a few yards, Gilbert suddenly turned to Patricia and wondered if she didn't like the town. She smiled and replied that she liked everything and everything was fine, though she didn't understand how she had to protect her parents and brothers since she couldn't be in two places at the same time. Even though she was now allowed to be alone, she still realized that everything was at risk. They continued walking, and then Patricia was approached by a girl who ran out from the alley. She called her a little girl and asked her to stop. Because the stranger was running so hard, she didn't notice the rock and stumbled and fell. As soon as the little girl lifted her face, Patricia noticed that she looked incredibly like herself from a past life, and that was indeed true. Patricia immediately began to move closer to her and noticed that the man's eyes were filled with darkness. She realized it was a perfect replica of her from the life she died in. When Patricia wanted to speak to the man, she heard a shout nearby. It belonged to a man who was addressing the man standing next to Patricia. The unknown man stood up and started to run away. However, Gilbert, who was standing nearby, reacted in time and grabbed the guy, knocking him to the ground. A grown man came up to them and smiled and said that they had managed to catch him after all. Gilbert immediately looked at the man and asked him what the man had done. The man explained that the man was a servant who had run away from his master. Smiling evilly, he added that the servant was just doing his job, but the servant bit him and immediately ran away. The man thanked Gilbert again for his help and said he would take it from there. Patricia at this point began to lift his clothes and saw the huge bruises, scratches, and abrasions with blood on his body. When she saw the boy's unhappy face, she immediately realized that he needed help. Rising to her feet, she said she was buying him. The girl turned to that grown man and inquired how much he wanted for this boy. But the man, hearing this, immediately laughed and asked what she was saying and inquired how old she was in general. Patricia briefly began to remove her earring and, tossing it into the man's hands, wondered if it would be enough for him. When the man saw what she gave him, he was speechless for a while. He could not believe that she was giving him an earring with a precious stone, which turned out to be real. Patricia, seeing the surprised look on his face, wondered if that wasn't enough, and immediately began removing the second earring. But the man stopped her at once and said that was quite enough. Then Patricia offered him a contract and, turning to the boy, asked him to stand up. She crouched down a little and held out her hand to him, telling him that he would now walk with her. Soon Gilbert took her aside, and the servant followed them. They went into an alley, and his brother said that was why he had said she shouldn't do it. They couldn't own servants of that sort. Patricia looked at him in surprise and asked if she was correct, that if he wasn't a servant of that sort, it would be all right. She wondered if he could go along with them, if he would just talk to her, but Gilbert, indignant, said it was all the more impossible to do so. The guy started yelling. He pointed his hand in the direction of the boy and said that it was unclear where he even came from, and Patricia was already in dangerous situations too often, so they should at least keep her safe here. The girl at that moment, looking at him angrily, immediately thought of all these situations that were happened just when she was protecting their family. But then she shifted her gaze to the boy who was sitting nearby on the boxes and wondered if he wanted to run away. He said nothing, but nodded his head in agreement. Then Patricia, coming closer, said that she did not forbid it, but wondered if he should go and eat a little beforehand. She also added that she wanted to treat all the wounds on his back so they would heal sooner. The boy was silent for a while, and then asked how much the earrings on her cost you. Patricia, smiling, immediately pointed to one of them and said that from now on it was up to him. They had no sooner finished their dialogue than suddenly the hooligans ran up to them and, smiling, said that, apparently, they were obviously not from the poor, so they asked them to give them everything they had. The merchant who had given them the boy began to smile evilly and mentally thought to himself that this Patricia shouldn't take offense. He thought it was her own fault for going out unguarded into such a neighborhood, for in this world the strong always eat the weak. And so, while the man stood there and took comfort in the plan he had come up with, he didn't even notice that that little boy had managed to kill all of his warriors with one blow. And when he heard some strange sounds, he immediately looked in that direction, and after that he saw his servant. The boy, when he saw him, immediately got angry in response and ran to him, and after that he hit him hard. He was incredibly angry at this guy because he was always bullying him. Patricia, along with her brother, stood back and watched in amazement. Then the boy came closer to her and wondered if he should take her earring from this merchant. But the girl, smiling, replied that he need not do so, for she had already gotten what she had paid for. Then the boy put his hands on her shoulders and moved closer. He diligently began to sniff her hair. This lasted a few minutes, after which he pulled back and said that was pretty good. Then he took her hands and said that from now on, he would serve her according to the price of that earring. Patricia, smiling, said she certainly didn't mind, and thought to herself that this boy looked incredibly like her. A plan formed in her head that she could train him, and the game she was standing with on her shoulders would become much easier. Soon when they got home, Leon, seeing an unknown boy who was incredibly dirty, asked his sister in a trembling voice who he even was. Patricia, wiping his dirty face, said she had bought it during her morning walk around town. Smiling, she also said that her brother Jill had said that she couldn't have a servant of that kind, so she could consider him a pet. The boy was speechless, for he didn't understand how a little boy could be called a pet. And why they'd brought him to the estate in the first place, he realized that his parents probably wouldn't be happy about it at all. Patricia paid no attention to him. She took her new friend by the hand and told him he needed to be changed and fed first. As soon as they stepped aside, Gilbert turned to his brother and said that right after they bought this guy, they got into trouble. Leon, hearing this, was even more surprised and asked what kind of trouble we were talking about. And the brother explained that Patricia had paid off her precious earring. But nothing serious had happened, because this guy had dealt with all the bullies on his own. So to summarize, Gilbert said that he might even be of some use to them. If one cultivated loyalty in him, he would be able to protect their sister. His brother immediately realized that this was why he had agreed to this guy. And he hadn't immediately guessed why Gilbert had let some stranger get close to Patricia. Gilbert, after giving it some thought, also said that he thought his father was up to something, for if he decided to marry her off somewhere far from home, they would not be able to protect her. At this very time, Patricia had already returned to the room and removed her new friend's cloak. She looked him over from head to toe in surprise, for the fellow had ears and a tail, and asked, "Is he half human?" In fact, half-humans, also known as beastmen, are very often targeted by slave traders because of their inhuman strength and speed. The guy immediately said he thought she already knew, and that's why she called him a pet. But Patricia replied that she was quite unaware of it, and had named him so in order that her brother might let her keep it. But she decided not to discuss the subject any further, and said that the most important thing at that moment was to take a bath. So they went just that way. The girl drew hot water for him and helped him wash his hair. She also said that she had never learned his name in all this time, to which the guy replied that he didn't have one, he was only called a wee one or worse. Patricia was a little surprised, but said that in that case she had to call him something to make it easier. The boy turned to her and replied that he wouldn't mind if she came up with a name for him. After all, she was his mistress. She immediately hesitated, and the boy felt very awkward, for he thought her rather strange and did not understand her true intentions. He's so dirty, and Patricia has taken to washing him herself, not worrying about her clothes at all. And what's more, she's not afraid of what he looks like, or what he does or says. They were traveling in a carriage, so he couldn't get a good look at the building, but her house is very large, and she's obviously not the usual rich girl. He had also heard the maid call her a princess, and he found it hard to believe that she really was one. At that moment, Patricia had already started washing his hair and kept thinking about the name she would give him. She didn't have a definite name in her previous life either. She always got the job done, and before she knew it, everyone was calling her Toto. Starting to rinse the foam out of his hair, she asked if he agreed with the statement that the meaning of a name was contentedly important. The boy looked at her uncertainly, for he did not know what she meant, to which Patricia, putting a towel over his head, said that from now on she would call him Toto. The boy, smiling, said that in that case he would only respond to that name and thanked her for it. A few days after Toto's appearance at the royal palace, Patricia began actively engaged in his education. They were sitting in a special room, and Patricia indignantly inquired whether he wanted to study at all, for the boy did not listen to her at all. Toto sighed heavily and said that of course he didn't want to teach anything, and that made the girl feel a little resentful. The boy didn't know how long it had been since he had moved into the palace, for he had been locked in the mistress's room all this time. She said that if his father found out about him, he'd definitely have a stroke or something, so he wasn't allowed to leave the confines of her room. There were not many differences from his previous master, but he was glad that he was not beaten. That was good. He was well fed, and he was not chained. Toto assumed that his mistress just had a peculiar hobby, and also believed that she had bought him just out of pity. Sighing heavily, Patricia said that there was still no way he could concentrate, so she offered to drink some tea. When she rose from her seat to ask the maid for it, he said he thought he would be more useful as a bodyguard. Toto looked her straight in the eye and told her that he didn't want to sit with books and cram it all in. He was ready to be on the battlefield and fight. Patricia, on her way out the door, replied that it was still quite early for him to move on to practice, so he'd better be patient. The guy was very hurt by the fact that she didn't take him seriously. He thought she had taken him as a toy for herself. He had no way of knowing what the wound even meant, and how could a whiny girl understand anything about martial arts training? And all he could do was fight. His brain was completely unadapted for mental activity. At that moment, Toto suddenly heard someone's hoarse voice addressing Princess Patricia. The boy was immediately frightened. He ran out the other side of the chair, which the bully had already managed to approach. When the man turned his head to the side, he saw an unfamiliar boy and asked in surprise, "Are these really half humans?" He was also surprised that the princess had a servant. He immediately realized why his previous attempts had failed and called the boy an idiot. But he didn't have time to finish the last sentence because he immediately ran up to him and punched him in the stomach. However, the man grabbed him by the throat and started lifting him up, saying that he was definitely not that strong. With advice, Toto said that he was out of luck after all. The boy felt that there was no way he could escape, and he didn't know what to do. But at that moment, Patricia appeared behind his back and said that whoever was unlucky, it was him. It hit him right in the throat, so the guy passed out and fell to the ground. Then the girl, smiling, said that apparently he couldn't hear her anymore and might never even hear her again. Toto looked at her in surprise and couldn't figure out who this girl was, since she had knocked out an entire bully with one punch. Then Patricia turned to her nanny and said that pests had gotten in, so she asked her to clean up the mess. When Deborah heard this, she immediately replied that she couldn't have anyone noticing it, so she had to get to work right away. The girl, smiling, said that she was sure Deborah would do quite well, and the nanny at that moment began to tie up the man who was still unconscious. Toto continued to watch his mistress and still didn't understand who she was. Patricia then turned to him and asked if he could now soberly assess his abilities. Toto looked at her suspiciously and asked who she was. After all, she was called a princess, but she had just shown great fighting skills. The girl turned to him, smiled, and asked in surprise, "Have I still not introduced myself to you?" Well, without waiting for an answer, she said her name, and added that she was the daughter of King Shaden Lawrence. She also said that she was also a princess of this country. The guy was incredibly surprised to hear this. In fact, by this point, the girl had already found several holes in the restrictions that had been placed on Patricia. Certainly, there were many things she was not allowed to tell, but that didn't mean Patricia couldn't reveal her abilities. For example, she beat a capable assassin to a pulp and managed to make her maid. So reaching forward, she turned to Toto and said she really needed him. The guy, still lying on the floor, asked what she even meant. Patricia explained that the lives of the royal family members were in constant danger, and he could become even stronger over time. So she would really like him to get good at his realization and protect her family. Toto thought to himself that this girl was definitely not normal, but without realizing it, he was mesmerized by her bright glow. And besides, wanting to protect the princess and her family, who are being targeted by vicious assassins, is only natural. Shortly afterward, the boy, walking through the corridors, heard someone's voice. It belonged to Julia, and she was just looking for him. He managed to react in time, so he hid, for he saw some dress in her hands, which alerted him. At that moment, Leon came up to him and smiled and said hello to him and told him that his mother was looking for him for some reason. The boy turned to him, sighing. He was clearly unhappy to have met them at this time. But Gilbert, seeing the look on his face, wondered why he was so displeased. Had he already forgotten who picked him up? The boy bowed and said it was his mistress, Patricia. Gilbert got even more angry and asked what he was talking about. He was incredibly pissed off by the fact that he had even gotten his mother on his side. Toto thought at that moment that he had done it, for she was much more relaxed about such things. When he became a servant, he learned that attempts were constantly being made on the lives of members of the royal family, and he realized that the princess wanted to entrust him to protect the king and queen during their visit to a neighboring country. But for some reason, the queen thought she was a doll and constantly dressed her up in strange outfits. At this point, Leon turned to him and told him that he was the one who had appointed him as his parents' personal servant, and wondered if he even understood why he had done it. Gilbert, without waiting for any reply, said that their parents were going there to match Patricia with a prince of a neighboring country. So Leon put his hand on his shoulder and told him in a quiet voice to make sure the guy would be worthy. He must memorize what he said, what expression he made on his face, and report everything to them. After that, he turned and walked away, and Toto said that of course he would fulfill everything. Then he thought about the fact that if this Patricia's fiancé turned out to be a really bad man, it wouldn't come to a report. He would kill him himself. At this moment, the girl was in her room. She had actually tried to train him more than once, but Toto was pretty good. She thought that if he and Deborah were with their parents, there would certainly be no problem, and she could protect her brothers herself. So the girl had everything going just fine, just as she had hoped. But then suddenly a maid came running into her room. She turned to the princess and said that there was trouble, for an envoy from a neighboring country had just arrived and informed them that an assassination attempt had been made on Prince Julius. Patricia, hearing this, was very surprised. She did not think there could be an attempt on her fiancé's life. And then she realized that he was probably now considered part of her family too, and she had to protect him. That kingdom in which the girl resided declared office on her 12th birthday, so God reborn her into this world and ordered her to protect her family. But she thought that protecting only her brothers and parents would be enough. However, if she married, the man would also become a member of Patricia's family. Julius is a prince that few people support. She has also heard that he has a half-brother. The girl realized that it would be very unprofitable for the country to spoil relations with this family, so she assumed that she should check with him in advance what was meant by the word family. So, temporarily for safety's sake, she has decided to consider Julius part of the family. However, It makes no sense for her to shift her attention from protecting her parents and brothers to a man who is in another country. So it was a mystery to her how she could protect the prince. She pondered for a while, then turned to Deborah. Patricia said she was very worried about Prince Julius and wondered what if he was hurt. She would really wish someone could protect him instead of her. The maid immediately ran up to her and asked if Prince Julius had already managed to win her heart. At this very moment, Toto knocked at their door and froze in mid-sentence, for he had not expected to hear such a speech. But Patricia, laughing, said it's not like that, and she doesn't even know what he looks like, but nevertheless he is her potential fiancé, so she's worried. Then the boy did go into their room and apologized for the intrusion. The maid, who was delighted that the princess had fallen in love with someone, looked at him immediately. Deborah was very angry and said it was wrong to barge into a lady's room like that. But the boy, indignant, replied that he had knocked and they had not heard him. The maid took him by his clothes and pulled him toward the exit, saying you could only enter after permission even if you knocked. Toto sighed heavily and said that she herself had walked silently into the room before, and she had gotten nothing for it. The woman, outraged, wanted to yell at him again, but Patricia suddenly entered the conversation and said that she didn't really care. She said that Toto was just her pet after all, and that making an animal snitch was kind of silly. Now, when the maid finally let him go, the girl said she could go, and also requested that as soon as any new news of Prince Julius came to her, she should inform her at once. Deborah, bowing, said that of course she would tell her everything at once, and then went out of the door. Then Patricia came closer to Toto and, taking his hand, inquired what was the matter with him, for she had noticed that he evidently did not like being his mother's doll. The guy was very nervous, so he couldn't formulate a sentence properly, but he asked if she had even ever dated a prince from a neighboring country herself. The girl replied that there was no such thing, and was very surprised that he was even asking such a question. But the lad said he had just heard what the maid was talking about, and it alarmed him. Patricia immediately told him that he might not address her so politely after all if he found it difficult, but the boy looked away and thought that of course he didn't find it difficult to do so. He just didn't like it very much. Then she explained that there had been an assassination attempt on Julius. That was what they had talked to the maid about. When Toto heard this, he looked at her in surprise and asked if it was true. The girl said it was true. She doesn't know what happened to him. He is her fiancé, so she was worried about it. Toto immediately wondered who it could be and really hoped it wasn't her brother's fault. Patricia went to the window at that moment and said that she was sure that their brother would raise his status in his homeland, which was why they were trying to get him out before the meeting with her parents, because after it, their engagement would become official. Then the boy asked if it was true that if the prince died, she would be at a disadvantage. The girl answered that she didn't know that and didn't understand what her father was thinking. But then she turned to him and told him that if Julius did become her fiancé, she could not let him die. Toto immediately came close to her and said that in that case, he would protect her. But at that moment, a maid came into the room again and told the princess that they were in trouble. She said that Prince Julius had literally just arrived at the palace. When Patricia heard this, she was very surprised. She hadn't expected that he might have arrived at the castle at all, for it was their family that was just about to go there. So, moving closer to the maid, she asked what it all meant, for she had not been warned that he was coming. Debola said in a trembling voice that it was true. The prince had arrived without any warning, and even her parents and the ambassador were unaware of it. They were all very surprised at this behavior and did not expect that a prince could do such a thing. Patricia didn't think the crown prince would take such a step without a good reason, or if he was just trying to insult them with his sudden visit. She immediately thought about this Julius and wondered what kind of person he really was. Toto immediately turned to the princess and wondered if he should go and check out the situation there. Patricia, however, replied that he should not do so, and turning to the maid, requested that she should prepare everything necessary. She said, smiling, that she was off to meet her future fiancé and was going to make a good impression on him. At this very time, in the royal castle of Scheiden, in the throne room, Lawrence sat at his chair and greeted just such a guest. The man apologized for keeping him waiting and said he had urgent business to attend to. He then turned to His Highness and inquired as to the reason why he had suddenly come to see him in person. In front of his throne stood the very same Prince Julius, who was very handsomely dressed. He had blonde hair and yellow eyes like the sun. The boy bowed and apologized for his manners, for he had arrived unannounced. But smiling, he said that what he wanted to discuss concerned a treacherous assassination attempt he had recently experienced. Lawrence, on hearing this, was very much surprised and said that he had heard from the ambassador that he had been attacked and his life was really in danger. The prince replied that it was plainly true that he had recently been assassinated, but as he could see, he was perfectly well. Julius, smiling, also said that he had heard that the ambassador had traveled to their country and thought he couldn't let them worry about his condition. He therefore hastened at once to the place to present himself in good health. Lawrence was a little surprised at this behavior, but said he understood. Poor Patricia, who had been standing near the door, eavesdropping on all this, realized at once that the ambassador was on the same side as the assailants, and the men who had made the attempt on Julius were trying to disrupt their engagement. To make sure her father didn't break the engagement, he had arrived in person, and the girl thought to herself that he was quite brave and determined, definitely not an idiot. In addition, he is confident that it will be able to repel subsequent assassination attempts. Patricia understood that Julius's half-brother was the organizer of the attack. This meant that her fiancé was first in line to the throne in name only. If he marries her, her father, King Scheiden, will be a support for Julius. Besides, if Julius takes the throne, the political influence of her father supporting him will become very huge. To put it another way, this was a turning point in history, and she was very curious to see what King Scheiden would decide. The man was silent for a while and then, smiling, said that he understood him. And the main thing was that the boy was safe now. He also said that Julius must be very tired from the road, so he would order that suitable quarters be prepared for him. The boy smiled and said he was incredibly grateful to His Highness Lawrence. But the man also said he would introduce him to his daughter, as she is very cute and he hopes they can get along. Lawrence also mentioned that the ambassador should still be in the castle because he was very worried about him, so he thinks he should see him. When Julius heard this, he was immediately wary, but said he would thank him properly. Immediately afterward, Patricia knocked at their room and, opening the door, turned to her father. She walked into the room and was just incredibly beautiful. The girl wondered if he had summoned her. Lawrence went to her at once, and hugging her tightly, said that she had come rather quickly, and it surprised him. Patricia explained that she had heard he had guests, and she was curious, so she hurried over. Then the man turned toward the guy who was standing nearby and said that he was a prince from a neighboring country. His name was Julius, and asked that the girl introduce herself. Patricia stepped forward and said she was very pleased to meet His Highness. She curtsied and introduced herself. Julius took her hand and kissed it, said his name, and added that he was very pleased to meet her. When Patricia saw Julius, she looked rather angry and even suspicious. Julius immediately noticed her facial expression and didn't understand why she looked so flustered. The girl at that moment turned to her father and asked if it was true that Julius was her fiancé. The man became alarmed and asked if something was wrong and what had happened. Patricia let go of her hand and said she wasn't sure, but somehow she thought the prince was hurt, so they should get a doctor. Lawrence, hearing this, was immediately interested and asked if this was really true. Julius, raising his hands, said there was nothing serious there, it was only a scratch. Patricia, smiling, turned to her father again and asked if she could take care of him herself. The man, smiling, said that of course she could, and called her a very kind person. Lawrence turned to the maid who had accompanied Patricia and said that in order to help them, she would go with them. The girl said that the inner palace would be best because very beautiful flowers grow there, and you can not only be treated but also enjoy that beauty. The man stroked her head and told her that they could go there then. Patricia immediately thanked him for his permission and thought to herself that he had been very helpful indeed. In fact, that very inner palace was her garden. There she could learn a great deal about Julius, thanks to the special herbs that grew there. This guy seemed very suspicious to her, so she wanted to really find out as much as she could and was very glad that her father still gave her permission to go there, because it was very important to her.